Now for the hard part, reassembling the hub. First, you'll want to take the axle and the drive section, place the axle within the drive section as it came off. Whenever I put the drive or the transmission sections on, I tend to spin them just to press the pawls down as I replace them. Next, you can replace this bearing retainer. Once again, watch out for dropped bearings. Here is the all-important key which I discussed earlier. It's caused me many headaches. It will slide right into the groove down the center of the axle. On other models of Shimano 3-speed hubs, there were two keys. In this version, one of the keys is replaced by a washer, which you will also perhaps forget, like I did, and have to go back and replace the washer as well. It is actually hard to believe how many times I have rebuilt this hub. This took me a few tries. I kept knocking the key out one side or the other as I replaced the transmission section, or the cartridge section, whichever you'd like to call it. Now you can place it back within the housing. I would probably spray some oil inside the housing. Once again, I'm using Phil's Tenacious Oil because it is so frickin' tenacious. You just want to make sure all the teeth on the inside of the hub are lubricated, because that's what your pawls will be continuously rubbing against. As I do here, you might want to stick your finger in and just make sure the lube is on all of the teeth. It doesn't hurt to have excess. It'll just float around in the hub. Here's the washer I mentioned. As I said, in other versions of this hub, or early Shimano 3-speed hubs, there was another key which would have fit in here. Here we just have a washer. Now you're ready to place the whole device back inside the hub housing. As I said earlier, spinning it a little might help. It'll just push the pawls down, if you push it the proper direction at least. Here we have our spring, our clutch spring, and our bearing cone. You just want to get this finger tight at this point. You'll have to adjust it later to get everything just right, just like with any hub or any place on your bike there are bearings. Here's the locking nut. Once again, this is a 17mm nut, the only 17mm ones on this hub. The other nuts are 15, as well as the cones. And once you throw the wheel back on the bike, you could throw that 15mm nut on. Back on the right, or drive side, or starboard side of the bicycle, we have the dust cap. Then a sprocket. These sprockets only have 3 inner teeth. Modern sprockets usually have 6. So once again, if you try to replace this, as many people do, because they don't like the gearing, you might have to file down some teeth. Now for the locking spring, or whatever you want to call this, locking ring. the one time you need a screwdriver. Usually, a small flat-headed screwdriver will work great. Here's that specialized washer. It'll fit into the groove in your frame and keep the axle from spinning relative to the frame. On some hubs, there's one on both sides. This one, the axle is only flattened on one side, so that's the only side that could accept one of these washers. We have the 15mm nut, which holds the axle to the frame. Another smaller nut. This one is basically a locking nut for the bell housing. Keep the bell housing from shifting. Here is the push rod. It's mushroomed out on one end, so it can only go in one way, I suppose, unless you apply a huge amount of force. Once again, I'm using Phil's tenacious oil, and probably way too much of it, in hopes that Phil will send me some components. Some people, as part of their regular maintenance, drop a few drops of oil down the center of the axle there on a regular basis. I think I've put in plenty for a year or more. If everything's gone together okay, you should have resistance, but you should be able to push in on the push rod and the bell housing. You can see how it works. You put tension on the cable by pulling the lever. That pulls this lever, which then pushes on the push rod. So, there you have it. We have reassembled our Shimano S3 3-speed internal gear hub. Here are two resources which may be of value to you if you continue to pursue these sorts of projects. One, Sheldon Brown. He knew a lot about bikes, especially 3-speeds, and especially older 3-speeds. Also, the Harris Cyclery, where he worked, is a good resource for parts for these sorts of bikes. Also, Glenn's new complete bicycle manual. It's out of print. I believe the last edition came out in 1987, but you can find them used online, and it is a very helpful book if you're going to be looking at fixing bikes from the late 80s and earlier. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you're working on this sort of project, I hope I've been able to help. Feel free to comment. Thanks.